Well, hey there, welcome back. So in this series, I'm looking at the letters to the Corinthians and specifically asking the question, are we Corinth? Are we still doing the things that the Corinthians did? And I guess what I want to do is maybe somewhat challenge some ideas that we might have that, we might have our problems in our churches, but at least we're not the Corinthians. At least we're not as bad as those guys because they just seem to be the absolute epitome of how bad Christians can be, or they weren't even Christians, really. They were just such a terrible, terrible bunch of people. So I guess I just want to push back on that a little bit and just sort of challenge some of that idea that suggests that that we're not like them anymore, when in reality, many of the things that we do really do resemble what the Corinthians themselves were doing. Now, the behavior itself might change. So we've looked at an example where a guy is in a relationship with his stepmother. Now, I hope that that's not something that's happening in your church, and I just genuinely hope that's not the case. But there was an attitude behind that caused them, or caused this particular person, not just to do it, but for the church to seemingly protect him. You had another example where they come into communion and they're getting drunk and they're having this great big feast. And again, we could go, well, hopefully we're not getting drunk at church when we're doing communion. I mean, a little cup of juice isn't going to do much anyway. But, what was going on behind that? What actually was causing them to behave in that way? And so I guess I just want to look at the attitude behind the Corinthians and see that really most of what they're doing comes from an attitude that is still very prevalent today. I mean, it's sin, right? That's what is at the core of all of these problems, is just human sin, human failing, and it just takes different forms depending on the cultural practices. So we've seen some examples of that. Now, what I want to get to this week, and probably leading into next week as well, I think we're going to spend a bit of time just on this particular topic here, is the question around our pastors. The question being, how do we measure our pastors? And as the title suggests, would we ever reject our pastor? Because when we look at the Corinthian letters, one of the things that we need to recognize is that at the core of both of these letters is actually a rejection of Paul. In fact, if you've ever stopped to ask the question, why is there a second Corinthians? Like, why do they need two letters? I mean, I guess, your first response would be, well, I guess they must have been doing something pretty bad for Paul to have to write to them again. And you would be right. Second Corinthians was written to the church because, well, First Corinthians didn't work, and First Corinthians didn't work because they completely misunderstood Paul, and really they had mischaracterized him. They had measured him against a certain standard that was just not applicable in the Christian context. But more than that, they had actually made an assumption about Paul that wasn't just false, but was actually, well, quite devastating to his character. And so we'll look at what those things are in a moment, only to say that this is actually why we have really both of the letters, in fact. One of the core issues going on in 1 Corinthians is a question mark over Paul's credibility, over his credentials as an apostle of Christ. And then by the time we get to 2 Corinthians, we've got a situation where the church has outright rejected him. And what 2 Corinthians becomes is Paul making a last-ditch appeal to this church and saying, hey guys, look, just here's the truth of who I am. Take it or leave it. This is what I am, but I can't be anything else. But at least try to understand where I'm coming from, the sort of person that I am. And so again, the reason behind all of this is the fact that Paul had been rejected. The Corinthians had measured him against the standard that was false and drawn the conclusion that Paul, to begin with, wasn't probably even an apostle. And then by 2 Corinthians, questioning whether he's even in the faith at all. And so it had got really quite devastating, and we can see really the decline in the relationship going on. But the question is, what was it about? Like, what caused them to draw these conclusions in the first place? And so really what was going on were two key elements of their assumption about Paul. And these, again, are really underscore really what is at the heart of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now, apart from the behaviors that we see going on in 1 Corinthians, the various things that they're doing wrong, but their attitude towards Paul is really what is at the heart of the need for writing these letters. So the two key issues that we're looking at, or the two key issues that are going on in the church, number one is a misunderstanding or a misjudgment about the nature or the quality of Paul's ministry. Paul, by his own admission, wasn't a great preacher. And, a pastor in a modern church in today could be forgiven for not being a great preacher. I mean, that's in many cases, pastors aren't that great. The preachers aren't that great orators. And that's okay. There's so many other measures by which we apply to a pastor that would make, sort of overlook the fact that he might not be such a strong preacher. It's a very different story in Paul's world, where the quality of your oratory, your eloquence is really at the center, or understood to be at the center of who you were. And so because Paul wasn't a great orator, this really worked against him in a way that we probably don't appreciate just from our modern perspective. But then the second issue that's going on is actually an accusation against Paul that he was embezzling money from them. And I know that it sounds quite random, like where does that come from? But actually, one of the core reasons why we have our 2 Corinthians is because of an accusation that had been made against Paul by some of the Corinthians, not all of them, but by some of them, that Paul was actually, in fact, embezzling money, stealing money from them. And so this is the primary allegation. This is the primary issue that is sort of at work, certainly within the second letter. And this is really what is at the core for Paul to have to deal with. And what we actually see happening as a result of this is a major falling out that has taken place in the church. And so what we'll probably do this week is just look at the story that's going on behind the sort of at the context of both of these letters, and look at the different passages where this is playing out. And where we're going to get to in the next episode is sort of the culmination of 2 Corinthians, which what we call this letter of tears, where Paul is making this last-ditch appeal to the Corinthians and really just laying out in the rawest possible way who he actually is, really just trying to show these Corinthians that what they perceive as being his weakness actually is his strength, is actually what aligns him with Jesus Christ. And so, again, we'll look at sort of the context of that and that story, and hopefully next week get to that bigger issue, that sort of culmination in that letter. All right, so the first key issue then that's going on, the first key accusation or difficulty that the Corinthians have with Paul is that he's ineloquent, that he's not a good preacher, he's not a good public speaker. Now, again, you would think, that doesn't sound like a big deal. Again, we probably go to churches where the preachers maybe aren't that strong. That's fine, and we can you can sort of let that slide. But again, in Paul's day, this is really a big deal. See, the world that Paul walked in was a world where oratory, public speaking, the ability to speak effectively was supreme. In fact, it was the measure of your character. It was the highest measure of who you were as a human being. So much so that the quality of your eloquence, how eloquent you were as an orator, was seen to be a direct reflection of the quality of your character. The goodness of who you are as a person and the moral uprightness of who you are as a person was directly correlated to how eloquent you were, to how well you spoke. And so oratory is supreme as an indicator of the type of person that you actually are. So just as a quick background to why this was, where oratory emerges in the ancient world, the ability to speak publicly emerges in Athens. So Athens is where we find the emergence of democracy, this new form of political rule, which is literally the power of the people. So democracy, it's two Greek words, the word demos, which means people, and kratia, which means power. So literally power of the people. Now, what was so unique about that was that it was in contrast to every other form of political structure of government, which was always a monarchy. That is, one person rules, whether it be a king or whether it be an emperor or just a tyrant. There was always one person in control that called all the shots. And that's just how the world was. I mean, that was really up until only a couple of hundred years ago. Everybody, every nation, every people group was being ruled by a single person. So the Athenians had got jack of all of this. There'd been a whole series of tyrants that had come and had been warring with each other, and it had all just been terrible. And so the Athenians just said, you know what, enough is enough. We're going to get rid of all of these tyrants. We're going to get rid of anyone who is trying to claim power for themselves and ultimately bring about our demise. We're going to get rid of all of you guys, and we're going to implement a new system where the people themselves are the ones that hold the power. They get to make the calls ultimately on what we do, on Athens as a city-state. The way we move forward will be determined by the people. And so we're going to put that power literally back in the hands of the people. Now, the way that this works was that every sort of region of Athens is maybe 50,000 people, maybe more. It's a large city-state, certainly by comparison to the rest of Greece. And so it's broken up into a lot of smaller regions. And so what would happen would be that representatives from all of these different regions would come to this gathering. They would come to this assembly or meeting of all of these representatives, which in the Greek is the word ekklesia. So it's a word you're familiar with. It's the word that we translate in our New Testaments to be church. So the ekklesia was just simply a gathering of all of these representatives. And within that, what would happen would be that all of the spokespeople for all of these different groups would voice their opinions. They would say, this is what my people want, or this is what my people want. And they would have to sort of present their case as to what the people want, and then what is going to be the best action or the best decision moving forward for the Athenian people. And so in order to do this, you need to be able to speak well. In order to have the most effective voice, or to be the person who can sort of steer this ecclesia in a particular direction, you need to be able to speak better than everybody else. And so you need to have that ability to speak publicly. But then along with that, for a democracy to work, so there's two key elements for a democracy to work. The first one is freedom of speech. You can't say that the people have power if they can't speak for themselves. It's as simple as that. Freedom of speech is absolutely essential to democracy, and when you take that away, you don't have a democracy anymore. It's just that simple. But the second thing you need for a democracy to work is the rule of law. The problem with having a monarch or a king or a tyrant is the corruptibility of the system, where the king can say, well, rules for you, rules for thee and not for me, right? We're going to apply all of these arbitrary rules to your life, but I can do whatever I want because I'm the king. And that's typically what was happening in these ancient contexts. And so the idea of a democracy is that everybody is equal under the law. This idea that we've got a law, and that applies to everybody because everybody shares in the power, shares in the responsibility of what this city does. And so in order for that to take effect, you need to be able to represent yourself. If you are charged, for example, for a crime, well, you need to be able to speak for yourself represent yourself, or speak for in your own defense to say that, hey, I'm innocent, or whatever the case may be. And so in order to do that, again, you need to be able to speak well. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person now has to become a public speaker. What you can do is get somebody to represent you, speak on your behalf, who is a trained speaker. And so, of course, we know these to be lawyers. So those are the fundamental elements then of a democracy, which is the freedom of speech and the rule of law. And for those to take effect, you need to be able to speak well, or at least have representatives who can speak on your behalf. That's what makes a democracy. And so for the Athenians, this is what was the new fashion, or this is what was the new way to do politics, to do power. What that requires then, again, is this ability to speak. How are you going to learn that? Particularly if you're from maybe one of the wealthier families that can afford to educate your children, or certainly your boys. Girls don't get educated in the ancient world. If you're wealthy enough, you want your children to be successful. You want them to, rise, to climb up the sort of the status and the rank of the city. And so the way that's going to happen is through politics, or just simply you yourself. You want to become successful. You want to be famous. You want to, do well in the political realm. Again, the way that's going to happen is that you need to be a good speaker. And so what emerges then out of Athens is this new type of education, which is training in oratory. Professional teachers who are there, who are expert speakers, can basically give your kids a university education in public speaking. So the educational system in the Greek world is very much a liberal arts education. It's physical training. It's sort of emotional training in the sense of training in sort of music and poetry and these sort of things, and then sort of logical training, mathematics and science and astronomy. So you've got this holistic education that a child will go through, and certainly how to read and write and to argue and to construct thoughts and this sort of thing. But the culmination of all of that is speaking. It's oratory. That's what sort of the capstone of your education. And so the most elite and the best educated boys are clearly the ones who can speak the best. So if you see somebody who's eloquent, somebody who speaks well, clearly that is a person who is educated. And if you're educated, what that means is that you've gone through this formational process. You have been educated, unlike everybody else who's poor and can't afford an education. You've been educated. And so because of that, you've been formed into this ideal person. In fact, the Greek word for education is the word paideia. Now, that paideia, we translate that as education, but more comprehensively, what it means is culture. It's to literally be encultured into the ways of the world, into what is superior in this world. And so education is to take a young man and form him into the ideal citizen. It's this holistic training, physical, mental, emotional, logical, everything about you is transformed into the ideal image of what it means to be a human. And so if that's the case, you yourself are superior. You're better than everybody else because you've been through this educational process. And again, the capstone of all of this is training in oratory. You're now not just a better person, but that's demonstrated through how eloquent you are as a speaker. And so these are the best. These are the superior humans of the society and the natural representatives of the rest of the people who don't have that education because, they've been working in the family business, they've been fishing or farming or whatever it is that they're doing. And so this idea really carried through into Paul's time. The Romans came along and they adopted it for themselves. The Roman political system, they hadn't come to terms with the fact that to be successful in the Roman Senate, you need to be a good speaker. That just hadn't occurred to them. And so when the Roman world came into contact with the Greek world, they saw these great orators and they said, how do you do that? Like, where did you learn how to speak so well? We want that for ourselves. And so what started to happen was that the Roman parents would send their boys to Athens to get this education in oratory so that their Roman boys could come back and then have the same sort of success in the Roman Senate. And so this ability to speak publicly, this ability to be eloquent, it was what was your ticket to success. It was what gave you a way to advance yourself above everybody else in the political scene, which is ultimately where the power is held and where the status and the superiority is held in the society. So oratory is absolutely essential, and it tells everybody else that you're better than them, that you are the best of the best in this community because you've been educated, because you speak well. And so your eloquence, how articulate you are, is directly correlated to your moral character. If you're not educated, if you are an uneducated person who's never been to school before, you are in the Greek, you are an idiotes, where we get our word idiot from. You're uneducated. Because of that, you're not sophisticated. Because of that, your character hasn't been formed. You're an inferior person. You're a base person, as opposed to these great speakers who are clearly better people. So this is the world Paul walked in. And Paul, his primary career, his primary occupation was as a public speaker. Yes, he did his leather working as well, but that was only just sort of a side hustle to fund his ministry whenever he needed to make the extra money. But the minute he didn't have to, the minute he didn't need to make money for himself, he devoted himself to full-time preaching. And this is exactly what happened in Corinth. When Paul came to Corinth, he came as a public speaker. Now, what was unique about Corinth, they were a standard ancient city. They were like every other city that had, they have certain expectations about what oratory should look like and what sophistication should look like. But Corinth has this other sort of element to its that sort of makes it somewhat unique, is that they every 2 years they hosted a set of games, this Isthmian Games. I might have talked about this before. These games were one of the four Pan-Hellenic games. There was four key games that happened in the ancient world. One was the Olympics, which of course we've just seen recently. Then the Nemean Games, the Delphic Games, but then also the Isthmian Games, which were one of the four key, or one of the four major festivals, athletics festivals that we have in the Greek world. Now, the context behind all of that is sort of beside the point, only to say that at these Isthmian Games that happen every 2 years in Corinth, one of the primary events in those games was oratory. Just imagine the Olympics that we just saw, where one of the key events was literally public speaking. Can imagine how boring that would be, or just how uninteresting that would be compared to, I guess, I don't know, we've got skateboarding and different things, whatever, I don't know. But for the Corinthians, every 2 years, the best of the best come to Corinth, and the best of this, and amongst those are the best orators. So Corinth literally hosts every 2 years the greatest orators. They're not just living in a world where oratory is supreme, but they're living in a world where those great orators come to them. They host the best of the best. And so they've got a very high standard. They've got a very high expectation of what it should look like. And so when Paul comes along to Corinth, he is a public speaker who automatically is going to be evaluated, assessed according to this standard that the Corinthians would hold. Now, of course, Paul would know this. Right, he knows what his world is. He's got a very clear understanding of what the expectation is. But what he also realizes is that if he presents himself as a great speaker, if he really turns it on and he's preaches these fantastic sermons and presents himself as being the most articulate and the most eloquent person that the Corinthians have ever seen, they're going to listen to what he has to say. No question. They're absolutely going to love everything that he's doing. The problem is going to be that they're going to equate that with the quality of his message. They're going to see Paul and say, well, this Jesus must be true because look how eloquent Paul is. Look how great an orator Paul is. And really what they're going to be doing is just effectively worshiping Paul. Paul would be stealing all of the attention. Paul would be the one that they're turning to and saying, Paul is our man, as opposed to the Jesus that Paul is preaching. And so for Paul, what he's trying to avoid is drawing the glory to himself, which is what a great orator will do. They will draw glory and honor and praise to themselves. And that's the whole point. They want to be praised. They want to be famous. That's the whole objective of being an orator. And so for Paul, he's trying to avoid that, because if you're worshiping me, that's completely counterproductive to what I'm trying to do, which is to get you to worship Jesus. So Paul does everything he can to try to downplay the quality of his preaching, specifically so that the church doesn't look at him, but rather he can draw the attention back to Jesus Christ. And so we see this play out later on in 1 Corinthians. It's a passage you'd be familiar with. It's in 1 Corinthians 2:1. It says, and so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and great trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. So what's happening here? The questions have been asked of Paul. You're not a very good preacher. What's up with that? And so what Paul is doing is giving something of explanation to what is, to why he wasn't preaching very well. But what is at the core of these questions, or what is at the core of the doubts around Paul, is actually what happened after Paul left Corinth. So Paul, as we know, was in Corinth for about 18 months. After he left, he went over to Ephesus, and shortly after that happened, a new preacher turned up in Corinth, a guy by the name of Apollos. Now, Apollos had been sent over by Priscilla and Aquila, who'd been Paul's partners in Corinth, and so there was a sort of strong connection there. But they had met Apollos in Ephesus, and seeing that he was such a good preacher, had sent him over to Corinth to be their new teacher, to get some experience of ministry over in Corinth. Now, what makes Apollos such a good preacher is the fact that he comes from a place called Alexandria. So Alexandria is one of the educational capitals of the ancient world. It's the capital of Egypt. It's an educational capital. And what they're most famous for is the training in oratory. If you go to Alexandria to get educated, you're going to learn oratory. That's what you're there for. They have the best instructors in oratory. And so Apollos, having been raised or trained in Alexandria, has learnt to become a great orator. And we see that in the way that Luke describes him in Acts 18, is that he's this powerful speaker, that he's a very powerful in argument, that he's very eloquent. He's got all the hallmarks of these great sophisticated speakers that this world has come to get used to. And so he's got all of that training. He finds himself in Ephesus, meets up with Priscilla and Aquila. They see his talent. And so having given him a bit more training, a bit more theological understanding, they send him over to Corinth as effectively Paul's replacement, right? Apollos is somebody that they trust. He's somebody that's sort of working on their side. And so they send him over to sort of carry on the work that has been left now that Paul has left. The thing about Apollos, however, is that that's his strength, right? Apollos is this great speaker. He doesn't have the same title that Paul has. Paul is an apostle. Paul can sort of lean back on the fact that he's been called by Jesus. That's kind of, he can lead with that. That's sort of his strength. And so whatever he might lack in eloquence, he can certainly make up for in the overall strength and authority of his apostleship. Whereas Apollos doesn't have that. Apollos is a young man. He's probably fresh out of university. He doesn't have the credentials and the runs on the board in the Christian circles, and certainly not the name that Paul has. And so for Apollos, he's kind of got to work with his strengths to sort of get a hearing, to sort of find a way into the Corinthian hearts, and that's going to be through his eloquence. And so he, turns up to Corinth and he blows them away. He is this great orator that the Corinthians have been hoping for. What they didn't find in Paul, they've now found in Apollos. And so Apollos, he sort of just blows Paul out of the water as far as the Corinthians are concerned. And so what happens as a result of that is you get a sort of some of these people who used to effectively be Paul's followers in the sense that that was the ministry they knew. But now that they've got this Apollos, they've kind of changed their allegiance. They're like, Paul was okay, but he was really quite average, actually. This Apollos guy, on the other hand, he's amazing. He's just absolutely the man. And so maybe he's going to become our guy. And then maybe beyond that, what is going to happen is that Apollos, having come to Corinth, continuing on the church planting work that Paul was doing, has probably continued on the evangelism. You would find that there'll be new Christians that have come under his ministry, and so maybe new house groups that have also emerged. And so what you're going to find is there's people who've come to Christ under Apollos' ministry that have never heard of Paul. They don't know who Paul is, or if they've heard about him, they've never seen him, they've had no experience of his ministry. And so their only exposure to the gospel is through Apollos. And so naturally there's going to be a sense of loyalty to Apollos as opposed to Paul. And so then the result of this is that you get divisions starting to happen. You've got some groups who are still remaining loyal to Paul and saying, hey, Paul's our man, we follow Paul, as opposed to some other groups who are saying, actually we follow Apollos. He's our man. One, because, he's better than Paul. We saw Paul, he wasn't very good. Now Apollos is here and he's much better. Or others that are going, we don't know who Paul is. We've never met Paul. Apollos is our guy, and so naturally we are followers of Apollos. But whatever the case was, what you're getting is effectively fan clubs. You're getting groups that are dividing up over who their favorite preacher is. Now, before we get overly critical about the Corinthians, ask yourself again, do you have your favorite preachers? When you go to the conferences, do you sort of come out and say to the people you're with, hey, who's your favorite speaker so far? Like we do this naturally. We have our preferences. We have, even for good reasons. We have people that are, we enjoy more or we resonate better with. It's just human nature. It's just the way that we work as humans. And so naturally the Corinthians are going to do this. The problem that lies at the heart of the Corinthian situation, though, is that they're measuring the quality of their apostles, or they're measuring the quality of their teachers according to their eloquence. Because Apollos is a better speaker, he must be better than Paul. He must, and Apollos is sort of teaching this wisdom that seems to be deeper than the wisdom Paul was teaching. Paul just gives us milk. This Apollos gives us solid food. And so he just seems to be better in every way. Therefore, he must be a better apostle. He must be a more superior teacher. And if we want to advance ourselves in the faith, we need to find the best of the best. And clearly that is Apollos, because he measures up according to our standards, certainly far better than Paul does. So what we get as a result of this are question marks over Paul. The question marks over Paul's capacity, question marks over his apostleship. Clearly there's better ones out there. We want the best. And so naturally we're going to be leaning towards Apollos. And we actually see this play out in 1 Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians 16, what you get is this little throwaway couple of verses that Paul says, or even just one verse, where he says to them, "Now about our brother Apollos, I asked him and he was quite unwilling to return right now." So what's actually happened there? Well, these followers of Apollos have said, when's Apollos coming back? When's our guy coming back? We would prefer to have him come back than you, Paul. So when's that going to happen? And Apollos, who was with Paul at the time, Paul says to Apollos, "Hey, what do you do? What are you going to do? You want to go back?" And Apollos would have been like, No. We're not going to. I'm not going to get in the middle of this. If I go back, it's only going to fuel these divisions even further. It's only going to reinforce what these people are already thinking. Best that I just stay here." And so he doesn't go back at that point. Which really, by refusing to go back, what he's essentially saying to his followers is that, well, I'm actually on Paul's side. I know you want to play us against each other. You want to make me to be the superior one, but actually I'm not going to play that game. And no, I'm going to stay here with Paul, which is going to cause an offense. We'll come back to that in just a moment, only to say that this is sort of this beginning to form the catalyst of what becomes some problems later on. But to return to our passage in 1 Corinthians 2, what's happened there? Paul's responding to the Corinthians who have raised questions about the quality of his ministry. That Paul isn't the sort of preacher that they've come to expect. And so what Paul has to effectively say to them is that, guys, I was putting it on, right? You think that I'm this inferior preacher. Look, I may not be the best, and by my own confession, I'm not the most eloquent speaker that the world has ever seen. I'm not going to blow you out of the water, but what you saw when I was in Corinth wasn't the real me. I was actually putting that on because what I didn't want to have happen is for you guys to think that, or to focus on me, to worship me, to honor and glorify me. I wanted the focus to be on Jesus Christ. And so he says, when I came to you, I didn't come with eloquence or wise speech. He says, I chose to know nothing except for Jesus Christ and him crucified. In fact, what Paul's sort of playing on here is one of the practices of these orators. These orators are celebrities, they are performers. And so when they turn up to give a speech, one of the greatest skills that you can have as an orator is to speak extempore. That means that you just speak without any preparation. You don't come with any notes, and so you can just say to an audience, "Give me any topic, and I'll speak about it here and now." And so these great orators would turn up to a theatre or a lecture hall, and they'd say to their audience, "Just give me a topic," and the audience would be throwing out different ideas, and so they would say, "That's a great idea there," and then they could just speak for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on this particular topic. And what that's demonstrating to the audience is how smart they are. I'm so educated that I know everything, right? That's the point of my education, is that I know all things and I can speak about all things and I can give this great articulate speech on anything you throw at me because I'm just that good. So when Paul came, he said, I didn't ask you guys what you wanted to hear about. I told you what you needed to hear. You guys wanted me to preach about all these different things. No, I told you what you needed to hear, which was Jesus Christ and him crucified. That was the message that you needed to have drilled into you and still do, because you're not living like Christ crucified. So I told you what you needed to hear. I didn't allow you the opportunity to dictate what my sermons were going to be every Sunday. But most importantly, he says, I came to you with weakness and fear and great trembling. I became amongst you as though I was that person, as though I was this pathetic speaker, again, so that you would not be paying attention to me. In fact, he says in the very last verse, in verse 5, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Paul says, when I was with you and preaching so poorly, I did that because if it was going to be effective, if you were to receive the message and be transformed by it, it wouldn't be because I'm so eloquent. It wouldn't be because I hyped you up and got you so excited that you have to respond to my message. But no, in spite of me, despite how bad I spoke, God still touched your heart. God still transformed you, even though I was doing everything I could to just be as inarticulate as possible. God still found a way through that, or you still discovered God throughout that. And that's exactly what I was trying to do through this process. So Paul writes this letter and he sends it off to the Corinthians. Number one, saying that, my lack of eloquence was an intentional thing, but even more importantly, saying to this Apollos crowd, hey guys, your man's not coming back, right? He's staying here with me, which they have taken to effectively be, well, you've both rejected us, and so, well, effectively, we're going to reject you. And so what we find out later on, in fact, is that the Corinthians, at least some of these I follow Apollos crowd, actually goes so far as to go and replace Paul. They go and find new apostles, and we meet them later on in 2 Corinthians, these so-called super apostles. And so point number one, what we're seeing here is Corinthians measuring Paul against a worldly standard that's so deeply entrenched in them that they can't see things any other way. And when Paul doesn't match up to that, when their pastor doesn't match up to the expectations that the world would otherwise place, they replace him. They get rid of him. They actually replace him with these new apostles. And so one of the sort of falling outs of this situation that we're going to find later on that becomes our 2 Corinthians is the fact that they've rejected Paul based on this worldly standard. But there's a second key element to this story which leads us to having our 2 Corinthians and ultimately leads the Corinthians to reject Paul, and that is this accusation of embezzlement. This idea that Paul is actually stealing money from them. Now, again, there's a bit of a backstory to this. And so what Paul has been doing throughout his missionary journeys is that he's been taking up an offering. Now, we don't see this in Acts until much later on in Acts 20 when Paul returns to Jerusalem. But throughout the course of Paul's missionary work, we see him preaching and starting churches and doing all the things that he's doing. What we don't see is this offering that he's been taking up for the Christians back in Jerusalem. So what had been happening back in Jerusalem is that if you remember from the early chapters of Acts, that they've been facing persecution, right? The Jewish Christians are, who've been, normally in a very Orthodox Jewish city like Jerusalem, are now followers of this Messiah, followers of this Jesus Christ apostate, and that's leading to persecution. It's leading to rejection from their families, rejection from the community. And we see this persecution very early on. I mean, Paul himself used to be one of the chief persecutors of these new Christians. So that's been one of the things that the Christians have been struggling with. And what it's also led to is poverty. It's led to this situation where these Jewish Christians are, starving. They're in a dire financial position because they've been kicked out of their families or they've been kicked out of the community, and so their means of support has been cut off. And so it's created a terrible situation for some of them there. And so what Paul's trying to do is to take up an offering for these Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. But there's a second dimension to this offering, which is that what Paul's trying to do is build a bridge between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. So you've got this, Jewish movement, Judaism, that has been, ever since the times of Moses, it's always been an ethnically Jewish thing. And now that movement's starting to spread out in the form of Christianity, and it's going off into the Gentile world. Now, this is, of course, going to bring with it its own set of problems because, Jews have always looked at Gentiles very disparagingly. And so now there's this expectation that, these Gentiles who up until now you've absolutely despised are now your brothers and sisters, right? These are now family. All of a sudden your arch enemy is now living with you. They're part of the family. You've got to call them brother and sister and love them like you would your own family. So there's a lot of bridges to be built here. There's a lot of work that has to be done to bring reconciliation between the Jews and the Gentiles. And one of the ways that Paul's Paul's doing that is very practical. He's saying, all right, I'm going to take up an offering from your Gentile brothers and sisters who you've never met before, people from the other side of the empire who are going to be sending you this financial support to show you that they're actually in the family, to show you their love for you. And so to hopefully build something of a connection, one of the ways maybe to build some sort of connection or build a bridge between the two groups. So this is what Paul has been doing throughout all of his time and throughout all his missionary journeys. And so that's no different in Corinth. When Paul gets to Corinth, one of the things that he's asking the Corinthians to do is to take up this offering. This is part of what he wants them to do. But there's another dimension to the story that also involves money that's also going to come back later on to haunt Paul, is that when Paul got to Corinth, what Paul was, again, was a teacher, right? That was what his primary occupation was. He was a teacher. He was a traveling minister, a traveling philosopher who, when that's your occupation, when you're a philosopher who travels from city to city, one of the things that you can expect is that when you get to a city, somebody's going to look after you, right? What you don't get in the ancient world are hotels. Right, you don't have. If you notice, all throughout Acts and even in the Gospels, you notice that there's no hotels. You say, "Oh yeah, well Jesus stayed in an inn." Well, no, not really. Or the inns were full. No, not really. It's not quite what we imagine in the sense of, roadside motels or hotels. It's sort of a different thing. What is expected to happen in this sort of Mediterranean culture is that when you come into a city, somebody's going to host you. Now, that can be somebody who you know. So if you go to a city and there's someone you know there, you can expect that they're going to host you, or somebody that they know. If you've got a friend and they've got a friend in the city, they'll say to the friend in the city, "Hey, my friend's coming. They're a good person. You can host them." Or you might come with a letter of recommendation. Somebody from another city that you're coming from knows somebody in the other city and say, "Look, when you get there, look for this person. Here's a letter." And they've never met you before, but this letter is going to give you sort of my endorsement that you're a person who can come and stay under their roof. Or at the bare minimum, if you're a teacher, you're somebody who has that as your profession, you can expect accommodation. You can expect that people will look after you, because for the person hosting you, that's a great honor. Having someone come and stay particularly if they're a famous teacher, to have them come and stay with you is a really, really big deal. And so in that sort of hospitality type world, that just means that wherever you go, you can expect this sort of treatment. In fact, we see this in the Gospels. When Jesus sends out the 12, he sends them out 2 by 2, and he says, when you come into a city, go and stay in the first place that accepts you. Not, "Hey guys, I've got this great idea," right? When you get to a city, how about this? How about you go and knock on someone's door and ask if you can stay with them? No, expect that they're going to host you. Just the question is going to be, who is the one who's going to host you? That's the only question here. So that's a very standard thing for Paul to expect when he gets there. Someone is going to offer him support, and for the person offering the support, this is a big deal. This is a matter of honor. Hey, this teacher came to the city and he chose me to stay with. So that's a really big deal. But there's a further dimension to this, which is that if you're a wealthy person, you own lots of slaves, but you've also got lots of people who are dependent on you, right? You're a patron and you've got lots of clients, people who are reliant on your resources for their own provision. In a world of extreme poverty, you need a wealthy patron to sort of help make ends meet. Now, that's a benefit to a patron. The patron owns all the resources, they have all the money, and so they want to have a lot of people who are dependent on them, because that demonstrates to everybody else, look how generous I am, right? Look how many people are reliant on me because I'm so generous and I'm so rich that I can support all of these people. And so that works to the honor, again, of this patron. But what you want amongst your clients, what you want amongst the people that are dependent on you, are effectively employees, right? You want people with different skill sets. You want people who really sort of make you look better by hanging around you. And one of the greatest sort of clients that you can have is a philosopher. Having your own personal walk-in library, somebody who's done all the research, somebody who knows all the books, who's done all the study, they work for you. You provide their means, you provide their resources, and in return, they live with you, they work for you, they are your employee, literally as your own personal literary client. So this is a really common thing. And for an educated person, if you've gone to all the trouble of getting educated, what you ideally will do with that is become a teacher, right? That's what you get in an education for. So you'll become a teacher. You'll ideally have a bunch of students who are following you around, and they're the ones you're training. And the fees that they pay, the student fees that they're going to pay, are the ones that are going to obviously support you and pay your wage. Now, the problem with being a teacher or relying on student fees is that the fees only get paid at the end of the year. So if you're a teacher and a bunch of parents have given you their kids or their teenagers to educate, it's not until the end of the year that the parents effectively come and pick up their kids and say, all right, here's your money, here's your pay. But what would often happen would be that the parents would say, "Oh, I'm not really happy what you've done with little Johnny here. I don't think you've trained him to the standard that I was expecting. So you know what? I'm not going to pay you. I'm not happy with the product, and so I'm not going to pay you." And so what that means is that these teachers can spend a whole year teaching these students, only to get to the end of the year and have the parents go, "No, we're not going to pay you." And it's like, well, now they're destitute. So it's a really risky business, right? It's definitely not something you want to sort of enter into lightly. So one of your alternatives would be to find one of these patrons and say, look, I'll just work for you and you can support me. Now, effectively what that makes you is a slave, because you are, the only difference is you're getting paid for it, but effectively you're a slave in that you have to do whatever the master wants, right? If the master is having a banquet, he's going to say, well, I want you to come and entertain the crowd with some philosophical discourse, or, I want you to follow me here and there. And basically you're at my beck and call. But I'm paying you, so you can't argue about it. That's what you're here for. And so when Paul got to Corinth, this is what they offered him. Somebody in Corinth has offered him support, probably in the form of being a literary client. They've said to Paul, hey man, we will support you, we'll provide for your needs while you're here in Corinth, but in return, you're going to be our personal apostle, right? You are going to be our guy. And basically what that means is that, we'll tell you what to preach, and we'll tell you where to go, and we'll tell you who to preach to, and basically you're working for us. And so Paul's like, well, that's not going to work. I can't do that, because if I'm preaching, if I'm working for you, then I can't be free to preach to all the people that I need to preach to, right? He says later on in Corinthians 9, hey, look, I need to be free to preach to slaves and to the free and to Jews and Gentiles. I need to be free to do all of this. And if I'm working for you, I can't do that. And so Paul refused that offer, but really what it would have been seen to be would be a rejection. They've said to Paul, hey, look, we're very generously offering you the support. And Paul says, no. And he effectively just sort of throws it back in their face. Now, that's an affront, right? That is a big deal in this sort of honor, shame, hospitality culture. You don't do that lightly, right? That is going to cause problems down the track. Nevertheless, Paul makes that call because he has to. Like he just can't sign up for that kind of deal. Instead, what he does is that he goes and does his leatherworking, right? He goes and makes tents. That's an even worse deal because, Paul as a teacher, should be this educated, elite, sophisticated guy who's uber wealthy and doesn't need to work. In fact, what makes you sophisticated is that you don't work, right? That's the point. You're educated, you're elite, you're articulate, you're sophisticated. You don't work. You have slaves for that. You have people that do that for you because you're better than them, because you're morally superior to them. Morally superior people don't work. They don't get their hands dirty. That's what other people do. Paul, as a teacher, not only is he not eloquent, but he's also, he's a laborer. He's a day worker. He makes tents. He does leather working. That's disgusting. And so in the eyes of some of these Corinthians who've offered him the support that would make him appear better in the community, Paul's not just rejected that, but gone and done the very opposite thing, which is to go and debase himself and become a laborer. But then one more dimension that just sort of adds fuel to this already burning fire is that when Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia. So we read about this in Acts 18. Timothy and Silas arrive from Macedonia, which is where Paul has just been. They actually bring support. They bring support down with them from the Macedonians, which enables Paul to to preach for free, to be able to go and be able to preach full time. He now has the resources that he needs. Now, what had happened with the Philippians is that they'd entered into an agreement with Paul early on that said, look, this is going to be a business partnership, a koinonia in the Greek. And the idea is that we will support you in your ministry, we will fund your ministry, and in return, you'll do what we can't do, which is to preach the gospel to the world. We can't get out there ourselves, but we recognize the need for it. So you go and do that for us, and we'll support you in that process. Much like a church today supporting a missionary. We can't go to those places where you can go to, but we will support you when you get there so that you can devote yourself to full-time preaching. So this is what they've offered Paul. So when Paul gets to Corinth, he rejects the offering from these Corinthians. Instead, he goes and becomes a laborer and works in a workshop and debases himself in that way. But then when the Philippians send some money down, he happily takes it. And then he stops working and devotes himself to full-time preaching. And all the Corinthians are like, what's up with that? How on earth, well, this is ridiculous that you would even, what is going on here? So this is a really difficult, challenging thing that Paul has done. Now, despite that, Paul still has some relative success. The church still gets established. But then afterwards, Apollos turns up, except that Apollos does accept that support. But Apollos does receive the support that these Corinthians have first offered Paul. They now offer that to Apollos, and Apollos does accept that. Now, it's not wrong that Apollos did that. That was the only choice he had. He didn't have a trade to fall back on like Paul did. He had to take whatever resources and support he could get. And so as a result, Apollos goes and receives that support, and he's more articulate, and in every way, shape, and form, he's exactly what we're looking for. Somebody who is eloquent and so therefore morally superior, but also somebody who is more compliant to the customs and to the standards of our world, which is to take support if you're a traveling teacher. And so Apollos has done that, which has only just further divided the opinions about Paul. You get this, I follow Apollos, but question marks starting to be raised over Paul himself. Is this guy really even an apostle? Because if he was, he'd meet our standards of what a traveling teacher, of what a philosopher, of what an eloquent, sophisticated man should look like. Paul doesn't meet any of that criteria, so really, is he really an apostle at all? So what we've got now is a situation where questions have been raised about Paul, that he hasn't conformed to what that world expected. And, if he really was this great, powerful man that he's claiming to be, he would do the things that great, powerful men do, men of education, men of class would do. He's not doing that. And so again, is he really an apostle? Is he really somebody that we should look to for leadership and for inspiration, when frankly we're probably better than him? We're at least we're probably of a higher standard than he is, because what we see in him really kind of sets him or defines him as somebody who's somewhat morally inferior. So again, can we trust this guy? Is this really what an apostle should look like? So that's at least the starting point of some of the doubts that have been raised against Paul. And again, the question or the issue stemming from a wrong expectation of what an apostle should look like. And I guess if we were to transfer that to our context today, a false expectation of what a pastor should look like. Do our pastors meet our expectation? And if they don't, maybe the next question that we should ask is, what is our expectation? What measures do we use to measure our pastors by? Are they actually Christian measures? Are they actually measures that are in line with the gospel that pastor is a minister of? Or are they worldly expectations of what we might find from a great guru or a great motivational speaker or a great CEO of a company? Are we using these categories to measure our ministers that are actually not Christian categories? Not necessarily wrong, but not the measures by which we should be applying to our ministers. Because this is exactly where the Corinthians are going wrong, is measuring Paul against standards that are simply not in conformity with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we'll pick up this story again next week, and we'll see how all of this has come to explode, and then leading on to ultimately what we find in 2 Corinthians, which is the culmination of all of this and really Paul's final appeal after what is, well, really an absolutely devastating fallout that takes place when this misunderstanding just completely blows up in everybody's face. So we'll get into that next week, but otherwise, have a great week, and well, I'll see you then.